The April sun hung over the Wyoming sky like a streak of fire dragged across it, red and heavy, pouring dense heat down Elora Winfield's back. She bent again, trying to lift the bundle of hay already thick with dust and heavier than usual only because her hands had long since given out. Strength left her left arm first, then her shoulder, then her breath ragged and uneven, as if she were running from her own life. The ground beneath her was so dry it cracked into pale lines, like the splits on her calloused hands after a long winter in which her father's death stole both warmth and the last bit of hope she had. When she tried for another bundle, a gust of hot wind swept past, flinging dust across her darkened cheek. Sweat slipped onto her lips, bitter with the faint metallic taste that reminded her she had been worn out far longer than she ever admitted. Still, Elora kept going. There was no one else. She bit down, lowered her arms and tried to gather the bundle. Her chest tightened. Her legs trembled as though the ground itself had grown too thin to hold her for one more day. And in that fragile instant, thin as the last breath of daylight, the shadow of a horse fell over the grass she struggled to lift. It was long, still, and swallowed the red sun whole. Elora looked up on instinct, her heart stumbling. Before her, a man on horseback had stopped without a sound of hoof or stirrup. He held as still as a frontier statue, solemn under a layer of road dust, his tall frame seeming carved from the earth and wind of this land. Archer Boone. She did not know the name yet, but the moment she met his eyes dark blue like a lake buried in mountain shade, she sensed this was the kind of man who had traveled far, lost much, and learned to stand quiet before things that should have broken him. "Ma'am, that load's too heavy for one person." His voice was rough, low, and spare, as though every word was meant only for what mattered. Elora straightened, despite the burn in her shoulders. "I can manage." He didn't argue. He only tilted his head, studying the bundle she held with the last of her strength. Then his gaze returned to her face, lingering a moment longer than she was used to. It wasn't judgment. It was recognition of exhaustion everyone else in town had overlooked all winter. "I'm not asking if you need help," he said. "I'm saying it's heavy." Her fingers tightened on the bundle, partly out of pride, partly out of fear. That letting go meant admitting she had reached her limit. "You should keep riding," she said, steadying her voice. "This is my land." Archer Boone lifted his hat slightly, a gesture offered with the formality due the owner of the place. "I know. That's why I stopped." Without waiting for permission, he dismounted. Hoofbeats thudded against the parched ground. Only when he drew near did Elora realize he was taller than she expected. The way he moved, the shift of his broad shoulders, carried the quiet of someone familiar with long roads, cold nights, and loss. He bent, placing his hand on the bundle just beneath hers. Their fingertips brushed light as a passing breeze. Elora startled, not from pain, but because it had been so long since anyone had stood close enough to be felt. A fleeting warmth, then gone, yet it left a tightness in her throat. "I can do it." But the bundle had already left her hands, lifted so easily she couldn't protest. Archer raised it as though it were nothing more than a thin shawl. He didn't boast. He didn't look at her to prove a point. He simply helped, with the quiet understanding of someone who recognized another person's weariness before they recognized it themselves. Elora stepped back, avoiding his eyes. But only for half a beat. She looked again, unable not to. Something in the way he stood beneath the red sun held her gaze. As if, in that single moment, this harsh world finally softened. As if a stranger had arrived, carrying the shade she had been missing for far too long. The sun slipped behind the far hills, leaving a wash of violet light across the dry grass. That faint glow settled over two figures working side by side, quiet. Without demands, only Elora's tired, steady breaths, and Archer Boone's calm, patient strength. The work that had drained her for days finished in a single afternoon. Archer carried each bundle into the barn as though their weight was nothing more than a small test for a body trained by long roads and an unsettled life. And Elora, though used to doing everything alone, felt an odd shift watching another presence move through the yard she had believed would belong to loneliness forever. When the last bundle landed in the corner of the barn, Archer lifted his hat and wiped sweat from his brow. Elara stood by the doorway, her hand fixed on the wooden frame as though letting go meant facing the truth that something in the past hours had begun to change. "You did more than I expected." The words slipped out uneven, not quite a full thank you. Archer only shrugged. "Just helped a bit. Day's still long." But the day was no longer long. And somehow, as the air cooled, Elara found she didn't want him to leave just yet. "Stay for supper." She said it before hesitation could catch her. "It's nothing much, just some bean stew." Archer held her gaze, as if making sure her invitation wasn't born from courtesy. Then he nodded lightly, as though he had just answered a question he didn't know he'd been carrying. In the kitchen, the lamp cast a soft golden glow that gentled everything. The worn wooden walls, the scratched table, the blackened pot over the stove. Elara washed her face with the little water left in the basin, then adjusted her faded scarf, her mother's scarf, its threads still holding a softness time hadn't managed to erase. When she turned, Archer was standing in the doorway, hat in hand, his gaze quiet and deep. It wasn't an assessing look, not pity, but the look of someone who recognized something familiar, fatigue in a soul that had lost too much, and offered it a silent respect. Elara turned away quickly, her heart knocking once. "I just wanted to look a bit less untidy." "You look fine." Archer said it plainly, yet something warm in his voice settled into the place she had kept hardened for months. They sat. Elara filled 2 bowls with stew and added a few old cornbread slices. The lamp threw their shadows against the wall, one straight, one leaning slightly as if 2 lives had met at the right turn of the wind. The quiet that followed the first few spoonfuls wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like the rare peace found when someone sits with you without needing words. Then Archer set his spoon down. "Your father passed this winter?" Elara nodded. Her dark eyes softened around the edges, like an old wound touched but no longer sharp. "He went fast. I didn't get to say anything." Archer nodded, his gaze lowering. "I lost my family to a flash flood. No one thought the water would come that fast." Neither spoke condolences. They didn't need to. Loss recognizes its own without an introduction. After supper, Elara cleared the bowls. Archer moved to help, but she stopped him with a slight shake of her head. "You've done enough for today. The horse stall. It's open, if you need a place to sleep." Archer slowly set his hat back on. "Thank you." Just that. But something in the way he nodded eased a tightness in her chest, as if his presence had been the missing weight that balanced a house long hollowed by silence. He stepped outside, his tall figure fading into the violet dusk. Elara lingered at the doorway, fingers unconsciously holding her scarf. The moment Archer looked at that scarf, and at her remained in her like a small flame. For the first time in months, Elara understood. Not all silence is loneliness. Some silences feel like an answer we never dared to wait for. Dawn came earlier than usual, as if the sky meant to rouse this worn-out land from its exhaustion. Elara blinked at the pale light seeping through the thin curtain. Her first thought wasn't about work or debts, but about the man sleeping in the horse stall behind the house. A brief confusion knocked her heartbeat off rhythm. She sat up, telling herself she needed to tidy up, stoke the fire, and cook something for him before he left. Courtesy demanded at least that much, and her heart wanted it, though she wouldn't dare call it by name. But when she stepped outside and the early cold brushed her face, she froze. Archer Boone was already there. He leaned by the well, working the pump, filling her old wooden bucket. Each steady pull sounded like the earth breathing. Near him, the outdoor fire had already caught, pine wood smoke drifting faint and sharp. A neat stack of firewood lay under the eaves, as if he hadn't been a guest the night before, as if he had lived here for years. Archer glanced her way at the sound of her steps. "Morning, Elara." Something in the way he spoke her name slow, low, Unhurried, unsettled her far more than such a simple greeting should. "You didn't have to do all this." Her voice came out smaller than she meant. Archer kept pumping, answering only after a long beat. "Saw work waiting. Hands weren't busy, so I did it." The offhand nature of the word stopped her where she stood, fingers tightening on her coat. How long had it been since anyone simply stepped in beside her? How long since a morning hadn't begun, with the feeling of being pressed to the edge? She didn't know what to say, so she crouched by the fire, adding wood and steadying her breath. Breakfast was simple: leftover cornbread, a bit of salted meat, and weak coffee warmed over the flames. But Archer's presence made the small kitchen feel wider, less burdened. He sat straight, those broad, quiet shoulders still, his hand resting on the cup as though holding something more fragile than tin. Alara grew uneasy at how often her eyes drifted toward him. "You'll be heading out this morning?" she asked, trying for an even tone. Archer nodded once. "The herd's moving toward Montana. I lost 'em 2 days back. If I don't catch up, I lose the job." Alara paused. The words she wanted to say, that the morning was still cold, that his horse needed rest, that she didn't want him to leave just yet, stuck at the base of her throat. "The road's long," she managed. "Yeah." Archer looked toward the window, where sunlight was spreading over the dusty yard. "But I'm used to it." In that dim light, she saw for the first time the solitude in his eyes, the kind that didn't complain, but lingered around those who had lived through more than their share. When he stood, Alara felt something inside her tilt, as if she too were losing a point of balance. They walked to the yard where his horse waited. He checked the saddle straps, adjusted the small pack, then turned to her. "Thanks for supper. And this morning." It was nothing. Alara bent down, wrapping the last piece of cornbread in a small cloth. Her hand shook not from the cold. She held it out to him. Archer took it, and when his hand brushed hers barely, light as wind over water, Alara felt her whole body halt. A warm line shot up her arm. Brief, soft, but enough to scatter her breath. Archer watched her longer than courtesy required. Then he set his hat, mounted his horse. "Travel safe," Alara said, her voice quiet but clear. Archer nodded the nod of someone who understood the deeper meaning beneath the words. Then he turned his horse and rode slowly down the dirt road that cut across the field. Alara stayed watching until he shrank to a speck beneath the endless sky, and only when his shape was gone entirely did she admit to herself that the land felt far too wide for her to bear today. 3 days passed like 3 years. Each morning, Alara worked in silence. Each afternoon, the wind swept across the wide land and made her feel small, inside a loneliness sharper than she remembered. At night, the sound of wind tapping against the wooden walls, once a harmless rhythm, now tugged at her with a hollow ache she had no name for. On the 3rd day, while she stood on an old ladder patching the coop roof, its boards worn thin since winter, she felt the ladder tremble in a way that wasn't caused by wind. She froze, tilted her head, listening. Hoofbeats. Slow, heavy, familiar enough to tighten her chest before her mind caught up. Alara turned. And he was there. Archer Boone rode his black horse, leading another burdened with sacks, lumber, rope, and a few rolls of old tin. Dust coated his coat, and the afternoon light draped over him that same quiet she remembered from the day he left. "You're standing too high for comfort up there." His voice was low and steady, as though 3 days had been a brief blink. Alara climbed down, her hands trembling slightly from fatigue, and something else she refused to name too soon. "You and..." His name caught in her throat. "You didn't catch up with the herd?" Archer dismounted, pulling off his gloves. "They went ahead. And I..." He took in her dry land, tired but stubborn. "I had time to help you." Something in his tone stripped the words of pity. It sounded more like a choice, quiet, solid, made by him alone. Alara folded her arms, trying to keep her guard high. "I can't pay hired hands. I'm not talking about money." Archer leaned an arm on the saddle, voice easy as wind. "You give me meals and a place to sleep. I work 2 weeks. We both gain something." Alara studied him longer than she intended. Relief flickered through her chest, swift enough to frighten her. For 3 days, she had told herself his presence had been nothing more than a pause in the life of a drifting man. But now, with 2 horses and half a load of material standing behind him, the things she had pretended to believe began to crack. "I'm not sure why you came back." She spoke the truth. "There's nothing here for you." Archer met her eyes. "If you want me gone, I'll go." Then his voice softened. "But I think you're tired. Tired enough that you haven't looked straight at the fact that you need another pair of hands." Alara drew a long breath. He wasn't wrong. And the way he said it without judgment, without pressure, kept her from shrinking under it. "All right," she said at last. 2 weeks. I handle meals and the horse stall." Archer nodded. "Fair trade." The days that followed settled into a rhythm between 2 people who needed few words. Mornings, Archer repaired the roof, strengthened the chicken coop, checked the well. Alara worked the soil, watered the garden, tended the kitchen. Afternoons, they moved through the yard a few paces apart, but as if joined by a quiet thread. Now and then, when she lifted a bucket too heavy, Archer appeared behind her, saying nothing, simply steadying the rim with his hand. The small gesture was enough to send her face turning away, hiding a wave of mild confusion she didn't quite understand. Once, while she fastened the rope on the well bucket, Archer paused, his gaze dropping to the cracked, dried cuts along her fingers. Wounds from cold, from dull knives, from work beyond what one person should handle alone. That look slow, gentle, carrying a strange kind of ache, held her still. No one had ever looked at her that way, not with pity, not with judgment, but with simple concern. "These cuts," Archer murmured, "shouldn't be left to scar deep." Alara drew her hand back, heart-tripping. "I can take it. I know." His reply was soft enough that she had to lift her head to see he'd already turned away, resuming his work. But her heart hadn't turned away with him. And that evening, under the darkening sky of late spring, Alara understood that Archer Boone's return had done more than lighten her burdens. It had unsettled the wall she had held around herself for years. The days that followed opened like another season, though Wyoming still held the harshness of late spring. With Archer Boone beside her, work that once demanded the strength of 2 people became possible. Not easy, but possible. In the mornings, they rebuilt the south fence. Rotten posts were replaced by the ones Archer had brought. He drove each stake deep, every hammer stroke steady and sure. Alara held the posts upright, her hands trembling from strain, while his remained unmoved, as if untouched by wind. When the fence stood finished, Alara let out a long breath. "Haven't seen this part of the land look like it had a future in a long time." Archer only looked at her, a brief smile crossing his face just enough to warm something inside her. By noon, they moved on to the well. Alara kept the rope steady while Archer hauled the bucket up to inspect it. At one point, water splashed her cheek. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, and for the first time in many long months, a small laugh slipped out of her light, as a leaf falling onto a quiet stream. Archer's head came up instantly. "I've never heard you laugh before." Alara flushed, turning away. "Haven't had reason to for a while." "Maybe now you do." His words weren't dressed in sentiment, yet when he looked at her, something in that gaze reached a place she had hidden through a winter of loss. In the afternoon, they cleared the irrigation ditch. The earth was hard, the water scarce, but with 2 people, the job moved quicker. Alara noticed Archer carried a strange patience. He didn't rush, didn't complain. He simply worked beside her, as if his presence alone steadied her enough to continue. One day, they rode into town for more supplies. The shopkeeper, a man known for the pinched look he wore whenever Alara stepped inside, muttered a mocking remark. "You paying this time, or putting it off again?" Alara reached for her coin pouch, heart thudding not from shame, but from the tired familiarity of being underestimated. Archer stepped forward, his voice low enough to halt the small room. "Think you ought to reconsider the way you speak." The shopkeeper coughed, his swagger evaporating. "I was just asking, meant nothing by it." Then you should pick better words. Archer said it with a chill in his tone, then turned toward Alara, his gaze softening. I'll carry that. Alara said nothing as they stepped out of the shop. She didn't know what to say. She only felt a strange safety, something she hadn't felt in years. You didn't have to do that, she murmured as they mounted up. I know, Archer answered quietly. Then he met her eyes. But there are things I want to do. That answer made her turn away, because if she held his gaze a moment longer, she feared she would reveal what was beginning to rise in her chest, something warm and frightening for that warmth. That evening, as they lifted the water bucket together to bring it inside, their hands brushed lightly, but both froze as if something electric had passed between them. Alara drew back first, though her gaze didn't leave his quickly enough. Archer steadied the bucket, his rough hand still holding a trace of the warmth from their accidental touch. The silence stretched, thick as the late afternoon air. Both knew that if one of them spoke just one word, the distance she had guarded for so long would break open like the old winter roof. But Archer only smiled faintly. Watch your hands. He said it softer than the wind. Alara turned away, though her heart remained where his eyes had met hers. That evening, the sunset spilled over the porch like slow-poured honey. When Archer stood adjusting a fence post, Alara paused beneath the eaves, watching him. He looked up. She didn't look away. Their eyes held longer than they should have, long enough that the vast, cold Wyoming land seemed to draw in tight until it fit inside the small space between them. And in that amber moment, Alara understood. Some fractures in a house can be fixed with wood and nails, but the fractures inside her were being mended by the presence of a man who spoke little, yet saw far too much. Evening fell earlier than usual. The sky turned a leaden gray, dragging a quiet unease across the land. While Alara washed her hands at the trough, the wind shifted suddenly, carrying a sharp, cold dampness. She looked up at the rumble rolling in from afar. Thunder, not the scattered kind. A real storm was coming. Archer, checking the stable door, glanced her way. Sky's turning bad. Let's get inside. But they didn't manage to secure all the shutters before the rain hit heavy, relentless, as if the sky had chosen this moment to empty what winter had left behind. Wind whipped under the eaves and slammed the wooden walls. The small house trembled. A sharp crack split the air, the bedroom window shattered, sending a sheet of rain slashing into the room. Alara moved on instinct, trying to wrestle the broken shutters against the force of the wind. Rain struck her face, cold enough to sting. Her shirt soaked through in seconds. Her hands shook, not from fear, but because no human strength could match the storm beating down outside. Let me. Archer's voice sounded behind her, low and steady. He reached her in a heartbeat, one arm bracing the shutter, the other circling behind her to keep them both steady. Heat from his body pressed against her back, a stark contrast to the cold flooding the room, and for an instant, Alara felt disoriented. She turned, her foot slipping on the wet floor. Archer caught her before she fell. His hands closed around her arms, firm enough that she felt she could let go entirely and nothing would break her. You hurt? His voice roughened under the strain of the storm. Alara tried to nod, but her legs weren't steady. She leaned into him, and the next moment, she was folded into his arms. His warmth mixed with the scent of rain and wet timber, forming something unfamiliar that her heart recognized long before her mind did. That moment, soft as an unspoken confession, slipped between them. Archer lowered his head. His breath touched her brow first. Slowly, as natural as a wind carrying the scent of pine, he lifted a hand to her cheek and brushed away the cold raindrops. Alara looked up. Neither spoke. The room held only the roar of the storm and the hard rhythm of rain beating the roof like the land's frantic heartbeat. Then he kissed her. Not hurried, not demanding. A long, slow kiss, like two souls recognizing each other in the middle of a storm, where nothing was left to hold on to but the warmth standing before them. Alara answered without thinking. In his arms, she felt something she had lost for far too long: shelter. The storm hammered the house, forcing them to secure the window again. By the time they finished, both were soaked and shivering. Archer slipped on the wet floor. Elara trembled from the cold wind cutting through her clothes. "You're freezing," Archer said, his hand resting on her shoulder in concern. But when his fingers brushed hers, Elara realized he was shaking too. "The fire. Let's go there." Her voice was so faint he had to lean in to hear it. In the warmth of the small bedroom, the fire brightened slowly. They spread an old blanket near the bed, close enough to share heat, far enough to keep propriety, though both understood that boundary meant little now. Archer lay on his side. Elara settled beside him. Her hand grazed his, not intentional, yet she didn't pull back. Archer intertwined his fingers with hers. Simple. Yet the simplicity held more weight than 1,000 spoken promises. No one asked about tomorrow. No one offered a vow. Words would have been excess. In the hush of that storm-torn night, they leaned into each other, breaths rising with the wind. Where her shoulder touched his chest, the world no longer felt too wide for her to bear. Elara closed her eyes, and she knew, as Archer knew, that the line they had guarded for weeks had fallen like the shattered window in the storm. A night without words? Yet everything changed. Morning came, but the light seemed unwilling to touch the ground. The sky looked like a wrinkled gray cloth sagging low, dragging a chill across the entire homestead. The rain had stopped, yet the air still felt heavy and damp, as if some part of the storm clung to the soaked earth. Elara stepped onto the porch, her feet landing on a long wet streak where the roof had leaked. The smell of waterlogged soil mixed with damp timber made her tighten her hand. From where she stood, she could see the eastern fence leaning, the chicken coop collapsed at one corner, and the spring garden she had worked so hard on, carved into deep channels by rushing water. The whole place looked like a living thing knocked to the ground. And she had nothing but her worn, tired hands. Archer appeared behind her, his boots scraping lightly over the damp wooden floor. He wore his coat, his hair still faintly wet. As he stepped beside her, the dim light fell across his face, where traces of a long night and words left unspoken still lingered. "Looks bad," Elara murmured, softer than she intended. Archer surveyed the damage, the way a man measures the weight of what has fallen. Then he said, steady and sure, "We'll fix it." The first two words, "we will," stopped her cold. Something pulled tight inside her chest. She didn't dare look at him, afraid that if she caught his eyes, her heart would leap into a hope too big a hope she didn't have the strength to survive if it shattered. "You say that like, you'll be here longer than 2 weeks." She tried for a neutral tone, but it drifted like wind through a tired door. Archer was silent for a while. He glanced at the loose porch post, the torn roof, then back at her. "I don't need to return to the herd," he said slowly. "Not if you'll have me stay." Those words dropped into her like a stone into a still lake, not loud but deep enough to stir everything below the surface. She swallowed. "Why?" Archer didn't answer right away. He tilted his head slightly, as though searching for a truth too bare to hide behind words. "Not everyone finds a place where they want to stop moving." A breath. "You make me feel that way." Elara drew in a sharp breath, as if cold wind had rushed into her lungs. I don't know if I'm good enough to." She didn't finish. Her foot slipped on the wet step. Her body pitched forward. Her heart jumped, but Archer's hand caught her at the waist, steadying her before she fell. A small touch. But Elara froze, as if time itself had lodged in place. His hand held her not tightly, not possessively, only enough to keep her upright. But that simple, measured touch warmed her in a way she could not remember ever feeling. She looked up and met his gaze, blue, deep, and steady, the gaze of a man who knew exactly what he wanted. "Elara," he said quietly, "I'm not staying out of pity, not because I owe anything. I'm staying because I want to be here, with you." Her chest tightened. His hand slipped from her waist slowly, as though he was careful not to step too quickly into something she wasn't ready to face. But the warmth of that touch lingered, spreading through her chest, her throat, down to her knees. "Archer." Her voice trembled like a wet thread. "I'm afraid. You came, and you could just as easily go. I can't bear one more loss." Archer shook his head. "I will stay, if you want me to stay." A simple sentence, but one that placed the entire choice gently into her hands, a gift she rarely received in her life. Elara looked at the damaged land, then at the man beside her, still limping slightly, still damp from the storm, yet steadier than any beam in the house that needed replacing. She didn't answer. Not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't yet believe she deserved to be chosen. The silence between them thickened, slow but not heavy, like a wind shifting direction, unsure where it would carry them. Archer didn't push. He simply stood beside her close enough that she knew the offer would not vanish if she needed time. And in that quiet moment, Elara understood. Her fear wasn't that Archer might leave. It was that he might truly stay. After the storm, the ranch felt like a great body recovering from fever. Patches of ground still held water, rotten boards had softened to pulp, and the groan of the roof marked every wound needing repair. Yet amid the scattered damage, Elara saw something rare. She was no longer standing alone. Archer stepped into each day with a steadiness that needed no declaration. He used a brace when he had to, relied on his shoulders and strong arms when he didn't. Though his old injury hadn't fully healed, he worked beside her through the worst of the repairs, the chicken coop roof, the broken fence, the eroded well edge. The saw's rasp, the hammer's thud, the scrape of metal on wood became the daily rhythm of a new season. One morning, Elara stood in the yard watching Archer secure a roof beam. A light wind pressed his shirt close to his back, revealing the muscles shaped by long days of labor. But it wasn't his form that made her still her hands. It was the persistence in every motion, the calm presence that made her feel some hidden foundation inside her was being set upright again. The strangest part was how her caution dissolved before she noticed. The way Archer set a hammer down always gently, as if not to disturb something fragile in the air. The way he asked about each task, never pushing, never intruding, made Elara feel heard in a way she hadn't since her father. And slowly, the fear of being left behind began to fade. One afternoon, they sat in the kitchen reviewing the ledger. Sunlight angled through the small window, laying pale gold across the pages. Elara frowned at the deficit. Archer leaned on his elbow, glancing once before understanding exactly what troubled her. "The north field's still good," he said quietly. "If you plant alfalfa, you'll get fair prices by fall." Elara looked up, surprised. "You know about crops?" Archer smiled faintly. "Wherever I stop, I learn a bit. Cowboy work isn't always steady." She paused, then wrote again, but something warm fluttered through her. This man wasn't only repairing her roof, he was quietly mending the corners of her life without asking for anything in return. In the late evenings, they often sat on the porch steps, watching the orange glow from the stove spill across the yard. Some nights, they spoke little, listening instead to crickets and the wind rustling through damp rows of soil. But those silences, deep, wide, gentle, let Elara rest in a way she hadn't known was possible. She no longer needed to hold herself upright by force. Once, Archer told her about his parents, about the flood that took their home. His voice didn't shake, but something nodded behind each word. Elara didn't interrupt. She only sat closer, letting her quiet be the place where that story could settle. In return, she told him about the winter her father died, about snow so heavy the door wouldn't open. Archer didn't say, "I'm sorry," didn't say, "Be strong." He only set a hand on her knee for a brief moment, as if reminding her she didn't have to withstand the weight of those memories alone. Then one evening, while the sun poured honey-colored light over the distant hills, Archer leaned against the porch post, watching a flock of birds settle on the damp field. His back curved slightly, his hat casting a shadow over half his face. Elara stepped behind him. She didn't know what drew her forward, only that her chest was full of a warmth that had been gathering for days. She placed her hands on his back, then slipped them around his waist, embracing him from behind. Archer flinched softly, not in surprise, but in the way something deep within him answered that touch. She rested her cheek against his broad shoulder. "Archer," she whispered, like calling a place of safety. He laid his hand over hers, gentle, yet firm with intention, and closed his eyes. A moment. A single breath. A quiet instant that told them both love hadn't arrived through grand declarations, but through the subtle recognition that they had belonged to each other long before either dared to admit it. The news arrived at noon, when sunlight pooled like honey across the still damp ground after the storm. Elara and Archer had just stacked more firewood in the shed when hoofbeats sounded along the road. They looked up Hollister, the storekeeper, rode his old horse toward them, his face flushed red from the sun and carrying the urgency of a man with something pressing to deliver. "Elara," he called, breath tight. "You heard about the railroad?" Elara shook her head. Archer stood behind her, arms crossed, silent as always. "The Northern Line's looking for steady farm suppliers, eggs, vegetables, dairy, everything fresh, regular, reliable," Hollister said, wiping his brow. "This kind of chance doesn't come often." Elara hesitated. "My place isn't strong enough yet." Hollister glanced toward Archer, then back to her, his voice softening in a way she'd never heard from him. "You're not working alone anymore." Archer didn't deny it. Hollister rode off, leaving Elara standing in the yard, her skirt brushing lightly in the breeze. She curled her fingers. Opportunities like this had always frightened her. They required faith in a future she hadn't dared look toward in years. Archer stepped beside her. "We can do it." "You really think so?" "Yes." He said it with the certainty of sunrise. He looked over the land, the half-finished rows catching the afternoon light, the cracked boards of the house, the hens clucking around scattered grain. "The Northfield's good. We can work it. And if we grow the flock, you'll have enough eggs for steady supply." "We?" she repeated, hardly aware she'd spoken aloud. Archer's gaze settled on her, darkening with a quiet intention that made her pulse falter. "Well, if you want me here longer—" Elara lowered her eyes, avoiding a look too direct, too revealing. Her face warmed, not from the sun. That evening, the narrow kitchen glowed under a single oil lamp at the center of the table. Elara spread out the ledger and scraps of paper. Archer pulled up a chair beside her. They sat close enough that their elbows brushed now and then, each touch faint as a breath, yet each one making her skin strangely aware. They calculated everything: repair costs, expenses for new hens, soil improvements, fertilizer. Archer wrote in bold, steady strokes. Elara noted details with the precision of someone who had lived too long in scarcity. Once, as she leaned in to read a line he'd written, her hair fell across one cheek. The lamplight softened the curve of her face where endurance and fatigue blended like evening sky. Archer paused. Not because the figures were difficult. He was looking at her. His gaze traced the sun-touched cheek, the line of her nose, paused at the soft curve of her mouth. Warmth flickered in his eyes, the warmth of a man who had found something he wished to keep, yet didn't dare reach for. Elara sensed the stillness. She turned her head. Their eyes met as gently as grass sinking under the weight of morning dew. Archer cleared his throat, pulling himself back down to earth. "Elara." His voice was lower than usual, as though meant only for her. "If you need someone to share the burdens, I'm here." It wasn't a love confession. But in a world where people fought to simply make it through each season, it was a vow. Elara set her pencil down. Her heart opened slowly, like a long-shut door easing toward daylight. She looked at her own hands with their cracks, scars, and winter-worn edges. Then at Archer's broad, strong, marked by the scars of a life spent wandering. Their hands lay side by side on the old table, not touching, but one small shift would bring them together. "Archer," she whispered, "for the first time in a long while, I'm not afraid of tomorrow." He tilted his head, his eyes studying her face. "Because you know someone's here?" Elara didn't answer, but her gaze, soft, deep, spoke more than any words she could have formed. Outside, the night wind swept beneath the eaves, But inside the kitchen, the warmth from the small fire and from the man seated beside her made the world feel gentler than she remembered. And in that quiet, tender moment, the future, once a thing she feared, became something she wished to walk toward, so long as Archer sat here, on her left, beneath the glow of the oil lamp. That morning began with Wyoming's rare clear light, the kind that comes only after storm winds have spent themselves, as if the sky wished to repay what it had taken. Elara stood beneath the porch, her hand brushing the wooden boards Archer had replaced the week before. The breeze carried the scent of wet earth and new grass, the kind that whispered a new season might finally be coming. Archer stepped out from the barn, brushing dust from his trousers. Something about him was different. Not his posture always steady, but the way he looked at her. His gaze was deeper, quieter, as if he had made a decision the wind itself couldn't shake. "Elara," he called, his voice low and warm. She turned, her heartbeat slowing in her chest. "What is it?" Archer didn't answer at once. He slipped a hand into his coat pocket, fingers closing around something small. His chest rose and fell barely, but she noticed. Archer Boone, the man who could stand unmoved in a storm, was steadying his breath. He stepped toward her, slowly, close enough for her to see the morning light catch the edge of his lashes. "There's something I want to give you." His voice sounded as though it came from deep within him. He opened his hand. In his rough palm, a palm lined with dust and old miles, lay a simple silver ring. No jewel, no fine carving, only a small circle of metal polished with care. The kind, made not to impress, but to keep a promise. Archer's hand trembled once. Not much, but enough to tighten Elara's chest. Archer. His name escaped like a breath. He shook his head gently, asking her to let him speak first. "Elara Winfield," he began, his voice rough with emotion he didn't try to hide. "I love the way you stand firm when the world walks away. I love the way you pull this ranch through each season, even when folks think you can't. I love the way you don't break even when you believe you've got nothing left to lean on." Elara lowered her gaze. The weight of those words was almost too much for her shoulders to hold. Archer reached out and touched the back of her hand. Not to claim, not to pull. Just a touch, like someone lifting a dried petal with care not to break it. "If you'll let me." He drew a quiet breath, his eyes bright, even in the still weak morning light. "I'd like to stand beside you for the rest of it." No wind. No sound. Only the long stretch of horizon and the quickened beat of Elara's heart, like a bird still brave enough to believe in spring. A warm droplet fell onto Archer's hand. Then another. Not because she was startled, but because, for the first time, someone's words did not make her feel smaller, they lifted her. "Elara," Archer whispered, as though any louder might cause her to vanish. "You don't have to say anything if you're not ready." But she was ready. Not because life had become easier, but because, for the first time, she believed she was worth choosing. She lifted her face, her dark eyes blurred but brighter than any dawn she'd seen. And she nodded, not hastily, not trembling. A steady nod, the kind given by someone laying her whole heart before a man who had held it up with bare, honest hands. Archer exhaled, a sound like gratitude itself. He didn't kneel. He didn't need to. He simply took Elara's hand in both of his, as if he held the most fragile thing fate had ever entrusted to him. And in that moment, on the same ground that had once left her hopeless but now shone with light, Elara understood. It wasn't the ring. It wasn't the words. It was the way he held her hand that made the proposal real. A gesture of respect. A promise. A clear, deliberate choice. And for the first time since her father died, Elara allowed herself to believe in a future shaped for two. Their wedding took place on a morning silvered with thin frost over the roofs of the small town. The church was only half the size of a cattle barn, yet when Elara stood inside it, her hand in Archer's, she felt as though she were stepping into a space wider than all of Wyoming's sky. There weren't many guests, a few neighbors, the pastor and his wife, and Hollister from the store. But every face carried a soft, quiet brightness, as though each person knew something sacred was taking shape between the two standing before the worn wooden altar. Archer didn't look at the flowers or at her dress. He looked only at her eyes, the eyes that once lived through long seasons of loneliness. And when the pastor spoke the blessing, Archer gave her hand a faint squeeze only the two of them felt. After the ceremony, they rode back to the ranch beneath a deep blue sky. Alara waved to acquaintances along the road, and Archer smiled in that low, rare way he had, the one that appeared only when his heart was truly settled. The railroad contract arrived the same afternoon they repaired the chicken coop roof. The messenger was Hollister's young helper, dusty-legged and breathless, but grinning wide. "Alara! Miss Winfield!" He thrust a folded letter toward her, excitement leaking through every word. "They picked your ranch." Alara froze, the breeze seeming to stop around her. Archer opened the letter, read it once, then lifted his gaze toward her. That look no longer the look of a passing traveler struck a warmth in her she had no name for. "We did it," he said. "Not you. We." That evening, as they sat at their modest table, Alara glanced around the small house. Cracked boards repaired, patched walls shining with new wood, and above all, a warmth she had never known before. Hardship remained. Money was still thin. The land still harsh. But with two people, everything weighed half as much. Summer passed on a slow, steady rhythm of hearts, finally at peace. Mornings they worked the fields, afternoons they cooled themselves on the porch, evenings they built a small new shed, and nights they sat by lamplight, reading letters from the railroad or planning the months ahead. And then there were the moments that never made it into any ledger. The way Archer brushed a stray wisp of straw from her hair. The way Alara touched his back lightly to say, "Rest a moment." No grand declarations. But love lay everywhere in the ragged breaths after plowing, in Archer refusing to let her carry anything too heavy, in Alara quietly saving the best piece of meat for his bowl. Near the end of fall, Archer spent 3 evenings working on something in the shed. He locked the door each time and only smiled when Alara asked. "Wait till it's done," he said, holding tight to a small surprise. One soft, late afternoon day, he brought her outside. There, in the golden light, stood a pine wood rocking chair, the cuts even, the nails straight, the surface sanded smooth, so every piece of grain gleamed under the sun. Alara reached out to touch it. The wood was warm. It felt like the same warmth she leaned into every night against Archer's chest. "You like sitting out here," Archer said. "So I figured a seat might spare you a little ache." A simple sentence, but within it lay everything he saw in her, the weariness she never spoke aloud, and the quiet wishes she had never voiced even to herself. Alara sat. The chair swayed gently, a slow, peaceful rhythm. Archer stood behind her, his hand resting on the back of the chair, as though it were his own heart. "Thank you," she whispered. Archer didn't answer. He only bent and pressed a long, soft kiss to her forehead, a vow without sound. Winter arrived a few weeks later. On the first night of snowfall, Alara set a hand over her belly, a strange warmth spreading through her body. By morning, as she stood in the kitchen watching the fire glow through the stove grate, she knew something had changed. When Archer walked in, she placed his hand on her stomach. "A new season's coming," she whispered. Archer stood still for a long moment. Then he gathered her into his arms tightly, wholly as though sky, land, and future had all settled into the space he held. 5 years drifted by as quietly as the water running through the irrigation ditch around the ranch, sometimes strong, sometimes gentle, but never once stopping. And when Alara stepped onto the porch that early summer morning, she felt those years hadn't been as long as folks like to say. They had been just long enough for a woman once worn thin beneath the sun to become a mother, a wife, and a part of something larger than herself. The ranch had changed so much that she sometimes had to step back a few paces to believe it was all real. The green stretches of alfalfa running northward, the bright, spacious chicken house, the new storage shed by the well, the sturdy cattle grazing across the field. And the house still old, but strengthened, widened, and glowing each night like a steady heartbeat. In the yard, two children chased each other, a dark-curled girl whose laugh rang like sunlight, and a 3-year-old boy trying earnestly to catch the barn's laziest cat. The wind carried their laughter all the way to the far fence. Watching them, Alara felt her heart loosen the way an autumn afternoon softens the land, not loudly, just warmly enough that she wanted to stand still and be grateful. Archer came from the barn, shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled high. He wiped his brow, then saw her. That look, even after 5 years, still made her pause. He stepped close and rested a hand on her back in the way that had long since become part of her. A touch that didn't claim, but reminded, you don't carry anything alone anymore. Alara leaned into him, her heart no longer guarded like it was in the old days, but open as a window at spring's first warmth. The railroad sent a letter today, Archer said, his voice steady as his footsteps each dawn. They want to increase next season's orders. Alara smiled. We can manage. Yeah, we can. Dear friends, at any age, we all deserve a place to lean, a hand to share the load, and someone who can say a small, simple thing. You don't have to carry this alone. If this story brings someone from your own life to mind, please share it in the comments. I would be honored to hear those beautiful memories. And if the journey of Archer and Alara has warmed your heart, please like, subscribe, and share so we can meet again in more gentle stories. Thank you for staying until the end. It truly is a happiness to have you here.